Hello, Full Sail University. My name is Marquetia Scott, coming to you from Irvine, California, and today we'll be talking about the horror genre and the evolution. The evolution of the horror genre first started and introduced in the late 1890s, which was released with the short film House of the Devil, which was released in 1896. This film featured cauldrons, skeletons, bats, and even their own version of the devil, all which we still see in horror films to this present day. In the early 1900s, films like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was released in 1920, and the first film to introduce vampires, which was Nosferatu, which was released in 1922. The Great War was a big influence on the horror films. James Whale, who introduced Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein, and Paul Wegener, who was responsible for the first monster film, The Golem, were soldiers of war and had these hard, terrible experiences and put them into the film to tell a piece of what their experiences were like during and after the war. But though, it wasn't until the 1930s when the horror genre really started getting its name. With sound being introduced, it took horror films to the next level. When sound came in horror movies, it gave the audiences more of a scare. They could hear the screams of the victims, you felt the presence of the killers, heard the creepy noises, and the loud thunderous storms. It was amazing for the audience. The 1930s also introduced movies like Dracula from 1931, The Mummy, and The Freaks, thanks to Carl Laell Jr., who was responsible for helping put together the pieces to make these films possible. It was this way through the 40s as well. In the 1950s, horror films changed again due to the Cold War. It brought fear of those who was afraid of nuclear warfare and being invaded and formed into the films like Godzilla, The Blob, and The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The 50s also introduced mad scientist films like The Fly and House of Wax. The 1960s introduced blood and gore movies as well as Psycho by John Hitchcock, which is considered the first slasher and took horror films to another level of violence. Blood Feast, which was the first splatter film and film to have blood with color. Zombies was also introduced when The Night of the Living Dead released in 1968. The 70s. The 70s horror genres was more focused on religion, devil worshiping, and the fear of kids at the times. Films like The Exorcist, The Omen, and Rosemary's Baby, and Halloween was all movies that targeted either young children or society's religious faiths or teenagers. Horror movies hit its peak in the 80s. Names like Jason Voorhees for Friday the 13th, Freddy the Krueger on Nightmare on Elm Street, and Michael Myers from Halloween. Although Michael Myers was released in the 1970s, he got sequels in the 80s, which made him more famous. The 80s is considered as one of the best decades for horror films due to these names and gore and decapitation of the victims. The 90s saw a lot of remakes of classic films. You can say horror movies lost its touch. There were a few hit films, though, that helped the horror genre get over the hump, which was The Silence of the Lambs, Ghost and Scream, which was a slasher/comedy, and basically saved the horror genre. The 2000s introduced films like Saw, which brought torture horrors, Final Destination, which brought unexplainable accidents and deaths, and had the world paranoid of everything, Blade, which brought back vampires, and Resident Evil brought back zombies. Around 2010, horror films kind of went back to religious beliefs with satanic films such as Paranormal Activity series, Last Exorcism, and The Conjuring. All of these horror films from the late 1890s to today, whether it's the remake of a classic film or in a new form, thanks to these original films and stories, we get the best horror story today. Yeah, my name is Marquetia Scott. Thank you for watching. Enjoy.